Iran's President Raisi is on his first official trip to Latin America with the aim of strengthening ties with countries that are affected by sanctions. Are we looking at stronger ties among countries affected by imperialism? Parcel service workers in the US are planning a massive strike if negotiations over their contract fail. What are they demanding? And finally, Japan is advancing further in an anti China direction. Will this lead to rising tensions in East Asia? Welcome to Daily Debrief. I'm your host Shriya, and these are the stories for the day. Iran's President Ibrahim Raisi is on his first Latin American tour where he will be visiting Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua to strengthen strategic ties with these opponents of the Western rule in the continent. The president will be accompanied by his ministers of foreign affairs, petroleum, defense, and health, along with his chief of staff and deputy for political affairs. Why is this tour important for global politics? We ask Abdul Rahman. Welcome back to the show, Abdul. So, this is the first trip that Raisi will be taking to Latin America. Some very important countries are on his agenda, and this is significant on many levels. Can you start off by telling us, like, what is the significance of this trip?
Well, Raisi is visiting three significant countries in Latin America or South America. One, of course, is Venezuela, which he already was there yesterday and before yesterday. Then he is visiting next Nicaragua. And then at the end of his trip, 5-day trip, he is visiting Cuba. So all these three countries, if you see, are the countries which basically have faced similar US sanctions as Iran has been facing for last at least 4 or 5 years. So these countries have even longer history of US sanctions. So this is an attempt to basically build a relationship. Though Iran already has a good relationship with Venezuela, it has been supplying oil to it because of the US sanction. Venezuelan oil industry was not working well. So Iranians were providing it oil despite the sanctions and helping its rebuilding its refineries, some of the refineries which were shut because of the sanctions imposed by the US. So that is one. Then they have also signed various other deals related to cooperation in the field of science and technology, tourism, etc., etc. Economic cooperation with the objective of raising the bilateral trade to $20 billion in future. That is one. Of course, it is a very well-known fact that they have a very good relationship with Cuba as well. They developed one of the COVID vaccines together during in 2021, and they also have collaboration in different other fields. Nicaragua is something which basically has come to closer to Iran in the recent past, primarily because it seems that they are all basically trying to basically bypass the US sanctions by collaborating among themselves. So these are the countries that are already sanctioned, and hence they have a larger scope among themselves to basically bypass the sanctions, and that is one of the reasons. Of course, also Iran has been looking to diversify its partners. If we have noticed how in the region, in West Asia itself, Iran has basically mended its relationship with Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region, and it is basically doing the same, strengthening the existing relationship, building new relationships in Latin America and South America as a part of the larger its attempt to revive its economy, build new cooperation areas in new cooperation with new countries.
And Abdul, I mean, the significance also can be for a larger global politics because, in Raisi's words itself, this visit is a strategic for building strategic ties against countries affected by imperialism. So, on that,
exactly that Raisi, before he left to Latin America, mentioned that his trip is primarily against the imperialism, hegemonic politics, and in an attempt in Venezuela, he said it is an attempt to basically make the global politics most multilateral, away from the arrogant powers. Both Venezuelan President Maduro and Raisi mentioned about arrogant power, and that arrogant power everyone knows in this context is the US. US has been using its military and economic power to basically dictate terms to the smaller countries, and Latin America has been a victim of imperialist interventions time and again. And so these Venezuela, Cuba are the countries which have been resisting the US hegemony in the region. Iran has been resisting the US attempts to hegemonize and dominate the West Asian region. So there is a common ground between these countries and Iran, and that this is the time to explore. That's what Raisi was saying. It is also a time to basically share the experiences which both the countries have while dealing with the sanctions, unilateral coercive measures. For example, Raisi was referring to how it has been able to develop its indigenous technology due to the sanctions in various fields, apart from the oil industry and in financial sector. It has also developed its own kind of weapon systems. So that there is a technological advancement in Iran due to the, and that is primarily due to the sanctions imposed, because they had no other way. They had to devise their own path. So now they're ready to share that experience with countries like Cuba, which is suffering from US sanctions for more than 6-7 decades now. Ever since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Cuba has been strictly sanctioned by the US, crippling its economy in particular. So because of that, the potential which Cuba had, or countries like Venezuela or Nicaragua had, the overall living standard of the people, which could have been better, uh, of course, could not develop as per its potentialities. So now, if they share their technological know-how with each other, there is a possibility of greater development, mutual development, and in a way creating a much more vibrant and multilateral world, as also out of the hegemonic dominance of the US.
Thank you for joining us for that update, Abdul. United Parcel Service workers have begun strike authorization votes across the US in anticipation of the expiration of their contracts on July 31st, a vote which is widely expected to pass overwhelmingly. By authorizing a strike, workers are empowering themselves to use the most powerful negotiating tool at their disposal, a work stoppage. Strike authorization results are set to come out on June 16th. If workers do end up striking following a failed contract negotiations on August 1st, it would mean that 350,000 workers, who collectively move 6% of the US GDP each day, could seriously affect the US economy. Natalia Marquez, who has reported this story for People's Dispatch, joins us now. Hi Natalia, thanks for joining us. So, what are the latest updates on the UPS workers' struggle?
So, right now, UPS workers are going through their strike authorization votes. So, across the country, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters is holding these strike authorization votes for UPS workers. And workers are essentially deciding whether or not, down the line, if current contract negotiations with the company fails, um, is the union allowed to utilize a strike? Are workers going to be allowed to go on strike? Ultimately, it's up to the workers, right? It's not up to the union leadership. If workers vote no, then the union cannot strike. But with strike authorization votes in the US, they almost always overwhelmingly pass. I haven't heard of a case where they haven't. We see numbers with the actors union, 97%, right? I think the writers union also 97% in their strike authorization votes. So overwhelmingly, workers vote to strike. So the prospects are good right now. And in terms of the contract negotiations, the union leadership has finished almost all of the supplemental contracts. There might be two left. Those supplemental contracts deal with individual locals, and the national contract right now is what they're going towards, right? So the national contract covers all unions, all union locals of UPS workers across the country. And it's actually quite unique because there aren't many agreements like this in the United States that cover all corners of the country for one employer. Contract negotiations are usually incredibly atomized. So this is good for the workers.
Also, if you could tell us about what are the key issues that the workers are facing.
So workers have several key issues. Um, one that I've been hearing a lot is that these 22.4 provisions in the last contract. So essentially, in 2018, when the union leadership at the time negotiated a contract with UPS, and this is the contract that's still currently in place, they added this provision called 22.4, which essentially stratifies workers and pays some workers less for the same work that other workers do, right? Um, and this is very damaging to the unity of workers, right? It's also a bad deal for those workers that do get paid less. Um, and so it was an incredibly unpopular measure, and the 2018 contract was actually voted down by the UPS workers themselves. But the leadership at the time forced through the contract anyway through an archaic provision called the two-thirds rule, which essentially said that since most of the workers hadn't even voted on whether or not to approve of the contract, they could just push through the contract. And so they did that. The union leadership at the time became very unpopular because of this, and there's been new leadership that was elected in 2022 that is promising to break from this mold of striking deals with the company. Essentially, Sean O'Brien has said many times that he wants to do away with the 22.4 provision. It's very, very unpopular among workers. Other issues are the fact that UPS wants to increasingly eliminate the full-time positions and make workers more precarious and more part-time and not offer them enough hours, right? I believe workers are guaranteed at least 3 hours a day. Oftentimes that doesn't happen in practice. UPS also splits shifts of full-time workers. So full-time workers are made to come in from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. and then go home and then come back from 4:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. Of course, this totally ruins someone's sleep schedule, someone's life. You have very little time for anything else with that sort of schedule. And, also just increasingly giving less and less part-time hours and underpaying part-timers. So a key demand is at least $25 per hour for part-time workers, and also the creation of more full-time jobs. This was a demand during the last UPS strike in 1997. One of the central slogans was "Part-time America won't work," which essentially means that this idea of destroying full-time jobs, destroying job stability for the US working class, it's not going to fly anymore. It's not okay. Things need to change, and workers are willing to fight to change that. And, we're talking to workers and seeing what's being said by union leadership, it's very clear that even today, many, many years since 1997, workers are still ready to go on strike based on these key issues.
Thanks for that update, Natalia. And with that, we move on to our next story where we ask if Japan is the new ground for building an anti China alliance in the East. This week, Tokyo is set to host a meeting of security advisors with the United States, South Korea, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, in a related update, NATO is planning to set up a liaison office in Tokyo to deepen ties with its Asia Pacific partners. We're joined by Anish, who has more details on this story. Thank you for joining us today, Anish. First off, can you tell us something about this office that NATO is planning to set up in Tokyo? What is its nature? What are they planning to do with it?
Yeah, so the office is going to be sort of like a regional office sort of thing, catering specifically to some of the pro-NATO partners in the region, which includes, apart from Japan, includes Australia, South Korea, and New Zealand, among others. So these countries are have recently started, looking for a certain kind of partnership with NATO. There are sort of individually tailored action plans, partnership plans that they are trying to uh, arrive at with the NATO, and that is pretty much trying to create a sort of a military alliance in the region as well, which would in essence try to just expand NATO's reach outside of just being a transatlantic uh, partnership or a military alliance to becoming a proper, global military alliance that will be basically run and, funded and, expand, entirely supported by the United States. We must remember that pretty much the US is the leading member of NATO, not just in terms of being the largest country, but also pretty much at various points of time almost entirely taking up its funding and its day-to-day management very often, even though you will have like a very rotational uh, chiefs plan, but even that doesn't mean that the US is as US always plays this very significant role. So it's essentially an extension of the US military industrial complex, and that is pretty much how this new office in Tokyo is going to be shaped. And that is obviously alarming to a country like China, because China is the target of such a partnership. We have to always remember how any kind of like the very genesis of NATO was basically to contain the Soviet Unions and the Soviet influence in Europe, and it was created very specifically for that. At various times, it even included ex-Nazi military generals being its heads. And that shows how this entire alliance was more concerned about containing not just the Soviet Union's influence, but also creating an ideologically aligned alliance that is against communism. And this is pretty much the same kind of thing that we're seeing when we see what's happening in the Asia Pacific region, where countries are trying to create this sort of pro-US alliance that is geared primarily against China, but is kind of accelerated by this sort of anti-communist rhetoric that we see rising in the region, and which for which obviously China is the obvious dog whistle in most cases.
Right, Anish, and you mentioned how these developments can, indicate towards in an anti-China direction from Japan's end. So there's also this meeting of security advisors between South Korea, Philippines, United States, being held in Tokyo. So what can we understand from that?
What we should understand is basically that Japan is offering itself as this pivot, and we talked about this in the show as well, but it's basically trying to become this pivot of pro-US alliance, military alliance in the region. Japan has recently, earlier this year, released white papers and defense papers that that had plans to essentially expand its military capabilities to undermine its pacifist constitution, and also to pretty much double its expenditure on the military over the next 5 years. And even though there are obviously domestic uh, blocks that is going to prevent, or if not prevent, but impede the growth of such kind of plans, it's definitely moving into that direction where militarism is a very likely possibility for Japan. And we must remember that this is especially concerning for all the countries in the region, and not just China, because of Japan's imperialist past. And obviously, aligning with the United States is going to mean that it is going to definitely have a significant heft in the region. And obviously, the meetings that we're going to see on Thursday and Friday are basically going to be geared towards creating and that sort of alliance where Japan will be the mediator for all such creation of alliances in the region. And obviously, South Korea and Philippines are going to be the chief kind of alliance partners, in many cases client states even, considering how we've seen the South Korean government has shown readiness to even forgive past war crimes on Japan's end, just so that they could move ahead with such alliances. Even in the case of Philippines, obviously the Marcos family has always been quite pro-US. There is no doubt about that. But at the current Marcos Jr.'s administration, we are seeing, it completely tilting the balance in the region, and even inviting U.S. Military and expanding its presence in the region, and even into the South China dispute, which the U.S. really does not have much heft in or even any claims towards. But still, you see that kind of military interaction and confrontation. Actually, it's not so much interaction, but confrontations happening in the region, and very much thanks to these military powers that are trying to align with the US more and more, at the cost of, completely tilting or, upturning the sort of peace that has always existed in the region for more than half a century now.
Thanks for joining us for that update, Anish. And that's all we have for today. For more such stories, keep watching peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.